The auctioneer didn't even try to hide the smile. Sold. 280 acres in the Sinker Tract to the gentleman by the fence for $5,600. A few men turned. More than a few laughed. One of them, a broad man in a pressed denim jacket, polished loafers, and a cream-colored pickup nobody ever let get dirty, leaned back just enough to see who had bid. Then he shook his head and said, loud enough for the yard to hear, "Well, there goes a retirement." The buyer was Harlan Webb. He was 63 years old. By the time the cashier's check cleared, he would have $23 left in his account. And he was smiling at 280 acres of drowned black Indiana muck. Ground that had already embarrassed 2 owners, swallowed 3 soybean crops, and convinced half of Newton County that the tract ought to be left alone and forgotten. Everybody in that auction yard thought Harlan Webb had just bought a swamp. They were wrong. What he had bought was the only piece of ground in the county perfectly suited to the one crop nobody there had the imagination to see. To understand why men laughed when Harlan bought the sinker, you have to understand what that ground looked like. Newton County, Indiana, sat on the ragged edge of what used to be the Grand Kankakee Marsh, one of the largest wetlands in North America, before people spent decades trying to tame it with dredge ditches and drainage canals. Even in the 1970s, long after most of the marsh had been cut, ditched, and forced into corn and beans, the land still remembered what it had been. It remembered in spring. It remembered after thaw. It remembered every time a ditch backed up or a low pocket filled and stayed full. The sinker was one of those pockets. Locals called it that because a loaded wagon had once buried itself to the axle there and taken 8 horses to pull back out. On paper, it was 280 acres of farmland. In practice, it was a shallow bowl of black muck and peat, low enough to collect water, soft enough to rut deep, and stubborn enough to stay wet weeks longer than the fields around it. In 1972, a spring flood had laid on it so long the seed rotted in the ground. In 1973, the man renting it disked half of it twice, gave up, and told people he was tired of farming a field that acted like a wet mattress. The auction happened in September of 1974. Richard Nixon had resigned a month earlier. Diesel prices were creeping higher after the oil shock. Corn farmers were talking inputs at the diner the way nervous men talk doctors in a waiting room. Every serious grower in the county wanted ground that drained clean, planted fast, and stayed predictable. If a field held water, it was a problem. If it held water every year, it was a mistake. If it held water the way the sinker held water, it was a punchline. Harlan Webb heard every version of that punchline. He heard it while he stood at the edge of the auction yard in a sweat-dark hat and a work shirt his wife Irene had patched twice at the elbow. He heard it from 2 brothers out of Goodland, who said they'd lease the place only if the seller threw in a dredge and a prayer. He heard it from a banker who told somebody else that farm ground wasn't supposed to move when you stepped on it. And he heard it most clearly from Lowell Granger. Every county has a man like Lowell Granger, not always cruel, not always loud, but so fully convinced that success proves wisdom that he treats every struggling person as a warning label for bad judgment. Lowell was 46 years old and born on the profitable side of every hard season. His father had built a grain, corn, and soybean operation across thousands of acres of northern Indiana row crop ground, and Lowell had inherited not just land, but the kind of certainty that money passes down better than manners. He sat on the board of the local elevator. He financed equipment through a dealership his brother-in-law partly owned. He wore clean cuffs through harvest. He was generous in public, careful with his image, and incapable of believing that a man with less money than him might see something he had missed. He had looked at the sinker already. He had sent his foreman into it with a probe, watched black muck come up slick and wet, and dismissed it in under 20 minutes. Needs drains, tile, a prayer, and maybe a boat. Then Harlan Webb bought it. After the sale, while men loitered in the shade and talked about prices, Lowell stood by his pickup with a styrofoam cup of coffee and watched Harlan sign the papers. "You really buy that mess?" Lowell asked. Harlan folded the deed into an envelope and tucked it under his arm. "Looks that way." Lowell smiled the way men smile when kindness gives them permission to be insulting. "Harlan, that ground has drowned beans, drowned corn, and near-drowned Bettis himself trying to pull a disc through it. I don't know what you think you bought, but it wasn't farmland." Harlan looked past him, toward the road, toward the cottonwoods where the ditch bent south and the sinker sat black and quiet under the sun. "Maybe not for what you grow," he said. That should have ended it. It didn't, because the thing nobody in that yard knew, not Lowell, not the banker, not the auctioneer, not even Harlan's grown children, was that Harlan Webb had been building this idea in silence for 4 years. He was born in 1911 outside Rensselaer, Indiana, the second son of a tenant farmer who worked ground too sandy in dry years and too gummy in wet ones. Harlan grew up in a world where nothing got thrown away if it could still be made useful. He learned to straighten bent nails on a feed sack with a hammerhead. He learned to listen to small engines until the miss in the timing separated itself from the noise. He learned that poverty is not dramatic when you're inside it. It is practical. It is the habit of asking what else a broken thing could become. He finished the 8th grade, then went to work. By 19, he was helping thresh oats in season and repairing harvest wagons in winter. By 30, he could rebuild a transmission with hand tools and patience. By 40, he'd tenant farmed enough rented acres to understand something many richer men never learn. Land tells the truth faster than people do. If you worked enough different ground, you stopped talking in categories like good and bad. You started asking different questions. Warm or cold? Tight or loose? Fast draining or slow? Hungry or rich? Early or late? Every field wanted something. Most men failed because they insisted on wanting the same thing back from all of them. Harlan and Irene had raised 3 children in a white farmhouse with a sagging porch and a pump that froze twice every hard winter. They had never owned more than 60 acres at one time. They had not had an easy life. Irene mended, canned, and kept books. Harlan rented, welded, scavenged, and solved. There were years they came out barely ahead. There were years they did not come out ahead at all. He was not a man anyone in Newton County would have described as visionary. What he was, quietly and without announcing it, was observant. In the fall of 1970, Harlan drove east to Celeryville, Ohio, to help his wife's cousin repair a sorting line in a Muck vegetable packing shed. He expected a few days of welding, maybe some decent pie, then home. Instead, he found himself standing on black soil so rich and soft it looked burnt, watching men pull onions out of ground that would have made a corn farmer curse. Celeryville was vegetable country. Muckland. The field sat low, dark, and flat, with drainage ditches cut like ruler lines and crop rows shaped with care instead of force. Harlan watched workers move through broad onion acres. He watched the undercutters slide through the soil. He watched bulbs roll up out of black ground, clean and heavy. He got into conversations at lunch with men who had farmed muck for years. And because Harlan knew how to listen, they kept talking. One older grower named Amos Klein drew him a rough diagram and spilled coffee on a plywood table. "That black stuff scares grain men," Amos said. "Too wet, too soft, too cold in spring. But onions don't want what corn wants. They want friable ground. They want moisture under them and air around them. They want loose soil so the bulb can size. One crop can make another." Harlan crouched in an onion field that evening and dug with his pocket knife. The top few inches were dry enough to crumble. Beneath that, the muck stayed cool and damp. The roots sat in perfect reach of water without suffocating. The ground held. Not like clay, not like sand. Like a sponge that knew exactly how much to give back. He thought of the sinker immediately. When he got home to Indiana, he didn't tell a soul what he was thinking. He just started watching. He drove by the sinker after rains and after dry spells. He walked the ditch lines when the tenant on it wasn't around. He pushed a tile probe down where the field rolled lowest and brought up black muck deeper than his forearm. He checked how long the standing water took to leave after a May storm. He paid attention to the weeds. Sedge in the worst pockets, pigweed on the edges, volunteer smartweed where the ground stayed damp but workable. He wrote things down in a seed catalog with a carpenter's pencil. He also started reading. The county library didn't have much on muck vegetable production, but Purdue bulletins could be ordered. So could trade magazines. So could extension circulars out of Ohio and Michigan. Harlan sent away for all of them. Late at night, after Irene had gone to bed, he sat at the kitchen table under a yellow bulb and read about onion spacing, drainage ditch intervals, neck rot, curing temperatures, storage losses, stand counts, bulb sizing, soil-borne disease in organic ground, and mechanical undercutting. He learned the central truth. The sinker did not need to be made into ordinary row crop land. It needed to be used as the strange land it already was. In 1974, most people in that part of Indiana associated onions with gardens, truck patches, or maybe a few acres for a local buyer. Nobody thought in terms of commercial onion acreage. Not like Michigan. Not like Ohio. Certainly not on 280 acres of black muck in a drowned basin everybody laughed at. Harlan did the numbers anyway. Storage onions had a market in Chicago. Packers wanted volume, uniformity, and keeping quality. Freight was manageable. If he could get the yield the Ohio growers were getting, even at a reduced Indiana level, he would not just make money. He would change his life. And the land cost almost nothing. That was the key. Men with money saw the sinker and calculated what it would take to force it into behaving like corn ground. Tile, deep ditch work, grading, years of expensive correction. Men like Lowell Granger saw cost. Harlan saw a different equation. What if you stopped trying to fix the field? What if you matched the field to the crop? That was why he stood in the auction yard in 1974 and bid when nobody else wanted to. He came home with the deed in a manila envelope and laid it on the table in front of Irene. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, looked at him, then looked at the paper. "How bad did you hurt us?" she asked. $23 left till beans come in on the South 40. Irene stared at him for 2 seconds longer than most women would have. Then she sat down. "What is it, Harlan?" He looked at her the way a man looks when he has been carrying an idea alone too long and is finally ready to set it down. Onions, he said. She blinked once. Onions. Storage onions. Big acreage. On Muck. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she reached across the table, tapped the deed with one finger, and asked the question that mattered. Can that ground do it? Harlan nodded. Not can, wants to. That winter he moved like a man with a private fire in him. He bought a worn-out potato digger at a liquidation sale outside Valparaiso because the chain bed was still good and the frame was straight. He found a junked bean windrower and salvaged the topper assembly. He traded welding work for a pair of used grating screens from a vegetable man in LaPorte County. He hauled home 3 barn fans from a turkey grower going out of business and built a curing shed inside an old machinery building by lining the walls with rough pine and spacing slatted bins down the center. Every spare dollar went somewhere useful. Seed, lumber, culvert pipe, ditch boards, fuel. A used transplanter he ended up not needing but stripped for parts. A small elevator belt to move bagged onions. Harlan did not buy new machinery, because Harlan had never lived in a world where buying new was the first answer. By January, the county had heard what he planned to do. The reaction ranged from amused to pitying. At the diner in Kentland, 2 men asked if he planned to make soup. At the elevator, somebody asked whether Indiana had become New Jersey overnight. At church, a woman told Irene she admired Harlan's optimism in the tone people use when they mean poor judgment. Lowell Granger turned the whole thing into entertainment. He brought it up in conversations he did not need to bring it up in. At a co-op board dinner, he told 3 men that old Harlan Webb had bought a mud hole and was now apparently farming vegetables on faith. At the feed store, he said there are easier ways to lose money than trying to turn swamp into salad. The public humiliation came in February of 1975 at the County Farm Bureau meeting. It was held in the back hall of a church annex with folding chairs, weak coffee, and the smell of wet coats drying near a radiator. A local extension man had just finished discussing input efficiency when Lowell, seated near the front as if by natural law, turned around in his chair and said what everybody in the room knew he wanted to say. "Harlan," he called, smiling, "you still planning to plant onions in that bog of yours?" A few men laughed because they felt expected to. Harlan sat near the back beside Irene, one ankle crossed over the other, hands folded over a notebook. "That's the plan." Lowell spread his hands. "Well, I don't enjoy seeing neighbors walk into trouble, so let me make you a better offer now than you got at auction. 7,000 for the whole tract. You clear a profit. We all stop pretending black soup is truck ground." It was a performance. Everyone knew it. The room got quiet. Harlan looked at him a long moment. Then he said, "Lowell, wet ground only embarrasses a man if he insists on growing the wrong thing." That line hit the room harder than any insult would have, because Harlan didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He just said the thing plainly. Still, Lowell tried. "Onions," he said, chuckling, "on 280 acres of marsh black. You'll be lucky if you grow enough for a county fair burger stand." Harlan took a sip of coffee. "I guess we'll see." That was the line people remembered. Not because it was dramatic, because it was final. Spring of 1975 came late, cold, and wet. For most growers in Newton County, that meant delayed field work and muttered complaints. For Harlan, it meant the first true test of whether he had been brilliant or just stubborn. Muck ground is tricky. That was one thing the Ohio growers had warned him about in every serious conversation he'd had. Too wet and you sink. Too dry and the surface can crust or blow. Work it at the wrong moment and you smear the seed bed into a mess that won't carry a stand. A good muck farmer learns patience the way other people learn language. Harlan had already spent March cutting new ditches, cleaning old ones, and shaping the sinker into long beds with shallow crowns and disciplined water movement. He did not want the field dry. He wanted it managed. The difference was everything. By April, the outer bands were fit enough to work. By early May, most of the basin was ready. He planted yellow storage onions in long, careful passes, seed placed shallow in the soft, dark ground with row spacing set by charts he had copied 3 times over winter. He followed every acre like a man reading pulse, checking seed depth, checking moisture, checking whether the planter wheels were packing too hard. For 10 days it looked beautiful. Then came the rain. A slow-moving storm laid over northern Indiana and dumped water in waves. The county ditch backed up. The south lateral on the sinker plugged with trash. It across 40 acres, then 60, then 90, flattening the tiny emerging rows into a black reflective sheet. By the second night, Harlan was out there with a shovel, a rake hook, and a flashlight beam swinging across the dark. The third morning, Lowell Granger drove by on the county road, slowed, rolled down his window, and took in the sight of Harlan standing calf-deep in black water beside a field that looked ruined. "Looks like your onions learned to swim," he said. Harlan didn't answer. He was too busy calculating what could still be saved. For 36 hours, he and his son Martin worked the ditch mouths and laid temporary boards to change the pull. Irene ran food out in coffee cans and brought dry socks twice. They rented a pump from a township man and set it up on railroad ties because the bank was too soft to trust. Harlan lost sleep, lost temper once, lost nearly 70 acres of his first stand, and for one violent hour around dawn on the third day, standing in the gray drizzle watching black water refuse to move, he came closer than he ever would again to believing Lowell might have been right. That was the low point. Not the laughter at the meeting, not the auction, not the jokes. This. Because mockery doesn't hurt as much when you still possess the future. What hurts is looking at the thing you bet your life on and seeing it fail in real time. Irene found him at the edge of the field near noon, soaked from the thighs down, hands black with muck, staring into the flattened rows. "You quitting?" she asked. Harlan shook his head once. "Then stop standing there like a man already buried," she said. He looked at her. Even then, after 40 years, Irene could still say the one sentence he most needed. By that evening, the water had finally dropped enough to show what was left. The stand was thin in places, gone in places, patchy where the soil had crusted after the floodwater slid off, but not dead everywhere, not nearly. Harlan made the decision immediately. He would reseed the lost acres. He used the reserve seed he had meant for next year, recalibrated the planter for the open strips, and worked the damaged sections only when the muck would carry the tractor without smearing. Men in town said he was throwing more money into the same hole. Harlan kept going, because skill is often just persistence with good timing. By mid-June, the second stand was up. By the first week of July, the sinker had changed color. No longer black, no longer reflective, no longer ruined-looking. It turned into bands of deep blue-green onion tops, stretching across the basin in disciplined rows, every slight breeze moving through them like a hand over fur. The field no longer looked like a mistake. It looked intentional, serious, even beautiful in the severe way large-scale agriculture sometimes becomes beautiful when a crop fits a place exactly. Cars started slowing on the county road, then trucks. Reasons to drive by. The first thing that shook them was simply the size of the stand. Not garden onions, not a little truck patch. A commercial field, a real one, something that belonged farther east or farther north in vegetable country, not sitting in a black basin outside a county that thought in corn yields and bean contracts. The second thing that shook them was how healthy it looked. Muck had done exactly what Harlan knew it would do. The bulb-sized and loose organic soil without fighting compaction. Moisture stayed where roots could reach it. The beds drained enough to breathe. Because Harlan had managed the field, instead of trying to force it into another identity, the crop came on thick, even, and strong. Tom Beale from Extension drove out in July after hearing enough talk he could no longer ignore it. He stepped out of his county car, walked 3 rows in, crouched, and pulled one bulb, then another, then a handful of soil. "You got this off the sinker?" he asked. Harlan shrugged. "Where else?" Tom turned the bulb in his hand. White, firm, clean-skinned, already sizing beautifully. "Who showed you this?" "Ohio muck growers, bulletins, some common sense." Tom stood there another minute, scanning row after row of onions on land he'd mentally filed for years under drainage problem. "Do you have a market?" he asked. That was the new tension, because growing the crop was only part of the problem. Selling it at scale was something else entirely. Harlan did have a market, but not a comfortable one. Over winter, he had written letters to a produce broker outside Chicago and to a packer in Kankakee, Illinois. They had answered with cautious interest. Everyone is interested in volume until the volume becomes real. Then they ask about uniformity, timing, curing, storage, grading, neck tightness, shipping losses, and whether an onion grower from a county with no onion history knows what he's doing. Harlan had promised them a sample load. Now he had to deliver a whole crop. And onions are not like grain. You do not simply cut them and haul them green if you want real money. They have to be undercut, topped, field cured if weather allows, then moved into controlled air so the neck seals and outer skin set. Rush that process and you lose quality. Miss the weather window and you lose the crop. Have too little labor and the field beats you. Get a wet September and the black ground that gave you life all summer can grab your wheels and hold them there while rot walks row to row. Lowell Granger seized on that vulnerability immediately. At the elevator in August, he told a small audience that even if Harlan had somehow managed to raise the things, he'd never get them out in time. "Vegetables ain't grain," Lowell said. "There's a reason people who grow them build whole lives around them. You can't read a few pamphlets and wake up Michigan." But Harlan had not read a few pamphlets. He had been preparing for the harvest almost as hard as he had prepared for the crop. He rebuilt the potato digger into an undercutter lifter that would slide beneath the onion roots, shake loose the muck, and bring bulbs onto the chain bed without bruising them to death. He adjusted the topper assembly until it clipped necks clean. He built slatted field crates and stacked them by the lane. He hired 6 high school boys for harvest work and told them on day 1 that slow hands cost money. He laid planks at the worst entry points so trucks wouldn't bog if September turned wet. He converted his machine shed curing room into a forced air chamber using fans, ducts, and a thermostatic controller borrowed and modified from a poultry setup. He had thought through almost everything. What he had not thought through was what it would feel like when people finally began to understand. By late August, the sinker had become a county destination. Men who had laughed at the auction now stood on the ditch bank with thumbs in their pockets, studying bulb size as if they had been early believers. Wives came out on Sundays in station wagons. Teenage boys pulled over just to stand in the black dirt and stare at a field that looked like a different state had been lowered by crane into northern Indiana. Irene noticed it before Harlan did. "They're not laughing now," she said one evening as they walked the headland. Harlan looked toward the road where 2 pickups had stopped. "No," he said. "Now they're measuring." The crop reached maturity in the first week of September. Necks softened, tops began to fall. The bulbs, when pulled, were heavy in the hand, layered tight, gold-skinned under drying wrappers. Harlan split sample loads by size, sent them to the Chicago broker, and got the call 3 days later. They wanted everything he could cure and grade. That should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like pressure, because now the crop had a real price attached to it, and every acre still standing in the field had become a stack of money vulnerable to rain, heat, soft neck, disease, labor delay, mechanical failure, and plain bad luck. Harvest opened on September 11th, 1975, but morning came cool, with a ground fog lifting slowly off the ditches. Blackbirds worked the fence lines. The sinker sat under a pale sky, row after row of laid-over tops waiting. Harlan started the old undercutter at 6:10. The machine shook once, settled into rhythm, and slid into the first bed. There are moments in every gamble when the idea stops being theory. This was that moment. The blade went under, the chain lifted, black muck rattled back to the field. Then the first run of onions rolled up. Big, clean, heavy yellow bulbs by the dozens, then hundreds, then a continuous living spill of gold against black earth. The machine worked. Not perfectly. Nothing ever does. Breakfast. One topper blade dulled faster than Harlan wanted. A tractor tire cut too deep near the south lane and had to be cribbed out with planks and a jack. But the system held. The undercutter held. The bulbs came out sound. The boys kept up. Irene ran the grading line at the shed and refused to let anybody bag sloppy. By 9 o'clock, there were cars on the road. By noon, there were more than cars. There were farmers standing by their trucks, county men with clipboards, wives shading their eyes, and 2 produce buyers who had driven down from Illinois because sample onions were one thing, and this was something else entirely. Tom Beale came back with a notebook. "What are you figuring for yield?" he asked. Harlan wiped his forehead with the back of one wrist and looked over the stacked field crates. "Maybe 17 tons if the late blocks hold. Maybe better." Tom stared at him. 17 tons an acre on first-year commercial muck onions in a county with no onion history was the sort of number that doesn't enter a room politely. It enters like a kicked door. By the second day, the story had outrun the field. Men at the diner were no longer talking about whether Harlan Webb had lost his mind. They were talking about acreage, ditch spacing, whether their own low black pockets might carry onions, whether the old peat basin by the railroad could be shaped for vegetables, whether muck that had punished corn for 20 years had been valuable all along. And sometime after lunch on that second day, Lowell Granger drove out. He parked along the county road, got out, and stood beside his clean pickup and boots he had not intended to put in muck. He didn't step into the field at first. He just watched. Watched the undercutter move. Watched onions pile into crates. Watched Irene direct 2 boys at the grader with the authority of a woman who had earned every right to be obeyed. Watched trucks backing to the shed. Watched a field he had dismissed as dead throw off money in broad daylight. A man named Calvin Hoke, who had been there with his brother, later said the strangest part wasn't that Lowell showed up. It was how quiet he got. No jokes, no advice, no polished little speech about risk. Just silence. Finally, he walked out to the edge of the harvested section where Harlan was kneeling beside a row, checking for skinned bulbs. Lowell stood there for a second, looking at the ground. "I was sure that field was worthless," he said. Harlan looked up. "It was, for what you wanted from it." Lowell nodded once. That was all. No grand apology, no public humiliation, no cinematic reversal. Just a man standing in the evidence of his own limitation, forced to admit that certainty and understanding are not the same thing. By the end of harvest, Harlan had pulled 4,680 tons of marketable onions off the sinker. Not every acre matched the best ground. The flooded and reseeded sections dragged the average. There were culls, there were losses, there were bags that didn't make top grade. But the numbers were still staggering. After freight, labor, seed, fuel, hired help, and equipment costs, Harlan Webb cleared more money in one season than he had made in several ordinary years combined. The land he had bought for almost nothing became, overnight, some of the most talked about acreage in the county. But the money, important as it was, is not the real reason people still told the story. The real reason is what happened after. Tom Beal wrote the operation up that winter for extension, not as folklore, not as local gossip, as a case study. Soil composition, ditch design, muck bed preparation, stand loss and reseeding, harvest method, curing setup, market channels. The report circulated through county offices and grower meetings across northern Indiana and into Michigan and Ohio. Within 2 years, several other growers in low black pockets around the old Kankakee Basin planted onions on trial acreage. Some failed because they underestimated the labor. Some failed because they thought muck alone was enough and ignored drainage discipline. But enough succeeded to prove the point Harlan had made with his field and his life. There is a difference between bad land and misunderstood land. Lowell Granger, to his credit, eventually learned that lesson too. In 1978, he converted 47 acres of his own trouble ground into specialty vegetable production and asked Tom Beal, very quietly, whether Harlan Webb might be willing to show him how he laid out his beds. Tom asked Harlan. Harlan said, "If he wants to learn, I'll show him." That was Harlan's way. He did not farm to humiliate men. He farmed to solve ground. Irene died in 1984. Harlan kept farming 3 more seasons after that, then turned most of the work over to his youngest son and a daughter who had married a mechanic smart enough to understand that the onion business was not a sideline anymore. The old undercutter lifter sat in the back shed for years, mud still worked into the chain bed. In 1992, Harlan's grandson repainted it and put it in the county fair parade. Most people clapped because they like old farm iron. The older ones clapped because they knew what that machine had done. It had pulled a hidden answer out of black ground in front of everyone who had missed it. Years later, when a regional farm paper interviewed Harlan and asked him what made him trust the sinker when everybody else walked away, he gave the kind of answer only a man with hard-earned wisdom can give. "Most folks spend their whole lives trying to make a field act like something it ain't," he said. "If you listen long enough, the field'll tell you what it's for." That is the part of the story that stays with me. On the surface, this is a story about onions, muck, and an old man who saw a market before his neighbors did. But underneath that, it is a story about eyesight. Not literal sight, the deeper kind. The kind that lets one person look at a flooded basin, a failed year, a strange soil, a thing everyone else has priced cheaply, and ask not, "How do I force this to become ordinary?" but, "What does this become if I finally let it be itself?" Lowell Granger looked at the sinker and saw inconvenience, expense, and embarrassment. Harlan Webb looked at the same ground and saw fit. That is a profound difference, and it matters far beyond farming, because most of us, at some point, stand in front of some version of the sinker. A career path nobody respects, a skill people call impractical, a relationship that looks useless from the outside, a piece of ourselves we tried to sand smooth because it did not behave like the thing the world usually rewards. We spend years trying to drain what was never meant to be dry, flatten what was never meant to be flat, and correct what was never actually broken. The lesson Harlan Webb leaves behind is not believe in yourself, at least not in the soft, empty way people usually mean it. It is something harder and more useful. Study deeply. Wait longer than loud people do. Learn the nature of the thing in front of you, and when the world calls it worthless, make absolutely sure the world understands what it is looking at before you agree. Harlan did not buy the sinker to prove Lowell Granger wrong. That is important. A man who builds his future on revenge becomes chained to the opinion he claims not to care about. Harlan bought it because 4 years of reading, walking, asking, measuring, and thinking had brought him to a conclusion stronger than mockery. He trusted the work he had done in silence. That is rare. And maybe that is why this story still lands the way it does. Because in the end, the most powerful moment was not the auction, not the joke, not even the first truckload of onions heading toward Chicago. It was the silence on the county road. The silence of people discovering that a field they had laughed at was not empty of value, only empty of their imagination. If this story stayed with you, send it to someone who's standing in front of a piece of misunderstood ground in their own life. And if you ever find yourself in a room full of people very certain that something is worthless, remember Harlan Webb, the black muck, and the old machine pulling gold out of a field everybody else had already abandoned.